For over 60 years, Mick Jagger has been the face of the Rolling Stones. But behind the swagger and success lies a darker truth. Jagger has been fighting a secret war within his own band, a battle for control that nearly destroyed the world's greatest rock and roll group. This is the untold story of power, betrayal, and survival in rock's most legendary band, the secret power struggle. What fans never knew was that Mick Jagger wasn't just the frontman of the Rolling Stones. He was fighting to be its dictator. While Keith Richards was lost in heroin addiction during the 1970s, Jagger quietly seized control of everything: the business, the music, the decisions. He became the puppet master pulling all the strings. But when Richards got clean in the 1980s and tried to reclaim his power, World War III erupted. The battle was so vicious that Richards called it exactly that: World War III. For years, these childhood friends became bitter enemies, fighting over who really controlled the Rolling Stones. The band nearly broke up forever. This is the story of how Mick Jagger's hunger for power almost killed the greatest rock band of all time. The struggle years, working class dreams. Michael Philip Jagger was born July 26, 1943 in Dartford, Kent. His father, Basil Joe Jagger, was a teacher who later became a lecturer. His mother, Eva Ensley Mary, was a hairdresser who later became a Conservative Party activist. The Jaggers were middle class, respectable people who expected their son to follow a conventional path. Mick was a good student and a natural athlete. He won a scholarship to the London School of Economics, where he planned to study business and finance. His parents were proud. Their son was going to be a success in the traditional way, through education and hard work. But Mick had a secret passion that his parents didn't understand. He loved American blues and R&B music. Artists like Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard spoke to something deep inside him. This wasn't the kind of music that respectable English boys were supposed to like. At school, Mick felt trapped. He was studying subjects he didn't care about, preparing for a career that didn't interest him. All he really wanted to do was sing and perform. But there was no clear path from middle-class respectability to rock stardom. Nobody he knew had ever done such a thing. Everything changed on October 17, 1961, when Mick bumped into an old school friend at Dartford railway station. Keith Richards was carrying a guitar case and heading to art college. Mick was carrying a stack of blues records under his arm. When Keith saw the albums, Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters, he knew he had found a kindred spirit. They had actually known each other since childhood. Keith lived just a few streets away from Mick in Dartford. They had been in the same class at Wentworth Primary School from 1950 to 1954, but they had lost touch when their families moved to different areas. Now they were reconnecting as teenagers with a shared obsession. Keith was teaching himself guitar, trying to copy the sounds he heard on American blues records. Mick was singing along to the same songs, dreaming of performing them himself. They started getting together regularly to play music and talk about their favorite artists. Keith introduced Mick to Dick Taylor, a friend from art college who played bass. The three of them formed a group with some other local musicians. They called themselves Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys. They played mostly cover versions of American R&B songs at youth clubs and small venues around London. Mick discovered that he loved performing. On stage, he could transform from a shy middle-class student into a wild, sexy performer. He learned to move his body in ways that shocked and excited audiences. He developed the swagger and attitude that would make him famous. But the band wasn't going anywhere. They were just one of hundreds of amateur groups playing the same songs to small audiences. Mick and Keith knew they needed something more if they were going to make it in the music business. The breakthrough: building the empire. The breakthrough came in April 1962 when Mick and Keith went to see Blues Incorporated, a band led by Alexis Corner, at the Ealing Jazz Club. This was where London's blues scene was being born. Young musicians would come to hear authentic American blues played by British artists. At the club, they met Brian Jones, a charismatic multi-instrumentalist who was obsessed with the blues. Brian was more experienced than Mick and Keith. He could play guitar, harmonica, and several other instruments. He also had the vision and ambition to start a professional band. Brian convinced Mick and Keith to join his new group. They recruited bassist Bill Wyman and drummer Charlie Watts to complete the lineup. The band went through several names before settling on the Rolling Stones, taken from a Muddy Waters song. But from the very beginning, there was tension over who was really in charge. Brian had started the band and considered himself the leader, but Mick was the most charismatic performer and natural frontman. Keith was the most dedicated musician and songwriter. Each had a different vision of what the band should be. Their first manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, recognized that Mick had something special. He was young, good-looking, and had a dangerous sexual energy that could sell records. Oldham encouraged Mick to become the face of the band. He also pushed Mick and Keith to start writing their own songs instead of just playing covers. The songwriting partnership between Mick and Keith was crucial to their success. Mick was better with lyrics and melodies. Keith was better with guitar riffs and arrangements. Together they created a sound that was uniquely their own, heavier and more aggressive than the Beatles, but still melodic and commercial. Their first hit, It's All Over Now, went to #1 in Britain in 1964. Suddenly, the Rolling Stones were stars, but success brought new problems. The band was making money, but who controlled it? They were famous, but who made the decisions about their career? Brian Jones had started the band, but Mick and Keith were writing the songs. The songwriters got the publishing royalties, which meant they made more money than the other band members. This created resentment and jealousy within the group. Mick was also the most media-savvy member of the band. He understood how to work with journalists and photographers. He knew how to create controversy that would sell records. He gradually became the spokesman for the band, the one who gave interviews and made public statements. By the late 1960s, Mick was effectively running the Rolling Stones. He negotiated with record companies, planned tours, and made business decisions. Brian Jones was increasingly marginalized, struggling with drug problems and mental health issues. Keith was focused on music, but left most of the business side to Mick. This was when Mick's hunger for control really began to show. He wasn't content to just be the singer. He wanted to be the boss. The rise, absolute power. The 1970s were when Mick Jagger truly seized absolute control of the Rolling Stones. It happened gradually, as Keith Richards descended into heroin addiction, and the other band members focused on their own problems. Mick stepped into the power vacuum and never let go. Keith's heroin problem started around 1968 and got progressively worse throughout the early 1970s. By 1975, he was using multiple times per day and was often too high to function properly. He would show up late to recording sessions or not show up at all. Sometimes he would nod off in the middle of playing. Mick watched his partner self-destruct and made a calculated decision. Instead of enabling Keith or walking away from the band, he decided to take control. If Keith couldn't handle the business side of being in the Rolling Stones, then Mick would handle everything himself. The first major decision was getting rid of Brian Jones. By 1969, Brian was even more messed up than Keith, using multiple drugs and becoming increasingly paranoid and difficult to work with. Mick orchestrated Brian's departure from the band, presenting it as a mutual decision but making it clear that Brian had no choice. Brian's replacement was Mick Taylor, a brilliant guitarist who was much younger and more malleable than Brian had been. Mick made sure that Taylor understood who was really in charge. Taylor would later say that he left the band in 1974 because of tensions with Keith, but the real issue was that Mick had created a hierarchy where everyone reported to him. With Keith incapacitated by drugs and the other band members focused on playing their instruments, Mick became the Rolling Stones' CEO, manager, and creative director all in one. He negotiated with record companies, planned tours, chose which songs to release as singles, and made decisions about the band's image and marketing. The power went to his head. Band members and crew started referring to him sarcastically as His Majesty. Keith, when he was lucid enough, would call Mick Brenda, a feminine name meant to mock what Keith saw as Mick's prissy, controlling behavior. But Mick's control also saved the band. While Keith was getting arrested for drug possession and nearly dying from overdoses, Mick kept the Rolling Stones functioning as a business. He made sure they continued to record albums, tour, and make money. Without his leadership, the band probably would have collapsed. During this period, the Rolling Stones released some of their greatest albums: Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Saint. These records were largely made possible by Mick's organizational skills and business sense. Keith might have written the guitar riffs, but Mick made sure the albums got finished and released. Mick also expanded his own role in the creative process. He became more involved in production, working with engineers and producers to shape the band's sound. He started writing more lyrics on his own and having more input into arrangements. The Rolling Stones were becoming his band, not just a band he happened to sing for. By the late 1970s, Keith was starting to get his act together. He went through withdrawal several times and managed to stay clean for longer periods. But instead of being welcomed back as an equal partner, he found that Mick had restructured everything around his own vision and authority. This set up the explosive conflict that would nearly destroy the Rolling Stones in the 1980s. Conflicts and hardships. World War III. The war between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards erupted in the early 1980s when Keith got clean from heroin and tried to reclaim his power in the band. What he found was that Mick had become a dictator who wasn't willing to share control with anyone. Keith had been through hell kicking his heroin habit. He'd been arrested multiple times, faced potential jail time, and nearly died from overdoses. When he finally got clean in the late 1970s, he expected to return to a partnership with his oldest friend. Instead, he discovered that Mick had been making all the decisions for years and had no intention of changing the arrangement. The first major battle was over the band's 1981 album, Tattoo You. Keith wanted to be more involved in the production and song selection, but Mick had already made most of the important decisions. Keith felt like he was being treated as just another employee rather than a founding member of the band. Things got worse during the recording of 1983's Undercover. Mick wanted the band to experiment with electronic sounds and dance music influences. Keith wanted to stick with traditional rock and blues. They fought constantly in the studio, with sessions often ending in screaming matches. But the real explosion came during the making of 1986's Dirty Work. By this point, Mick was openly dismissive of Keith's opinions and suggestions. He would show up to recording sessions with songs already written and arrangements already planned. Keith felt like he was being asked to be a hired gun in his own band. Keith started fighting back through the music itself. On Dirty Work, he sang lead vocals on a song called All About You, which was widely interpreted as an attack on Mick. The lyrics talked about someone with an inflated ego who needed all the attention for themselves. Keith later admitted that the song was indeed about his frustrations with Mick. The situation became so toxic that the band canceled their planned tour to support Dirty Work. This was unprecedented. The Rolling Stones had never failed to tour behind a new album, but the animosity between Mick and Keith had reached the point where they couldn't stand to be on stage together. Instead, both men decided to pursue solo careers. Mick released She's the Boss in 1985 and Primitive Cool in 1987. Keith responded with Talk is Cheap in 1988. They were essentially competing against each other, trying to prove who was the real talent behind the Rolling Stones. The press had a field day with the feud. Keith gave interviews where he called Mick's solo music dog shit and said that Mick was unbearable to work with. Mick responded by saying that Keith was stuck in the past and couldn't adapt to changing musical styles. Keith later referred to this period as World War III, and that's exactly what it felt like to everyone around the band. Crew members, managers, and record company executives had to choose sides. Some supported Mick's vision of the band as a modern, commercially viable entity. Others backed Keith's belief that the Rolling Stones should stick to their rock and blues roots. The war reached its peak when Mick started touring as a solo artist without the Rolling Stones. This was seen as the ultimate betrayal by Keith and the other band members. If Mick could tour and make money without the band, why did he need the Rolling Stones at all? Reinvention, the uneasy truce. By 1988, both Mick Jagger and Keith Richards realized that they needed each other more than they needed to win their personal war. Their solo careers had been moderately successful, but nothing compared to the power and popularity of the Rolling Stones. They swallowed their pride and agreed to make peace. The reconciliation began with a meeting in Barbados in January 1989. Mick and Keith sat down with just a couple of guitars and a tape recorder and started working on songs together. It was the first time in years that they had collaborated without the tension and hostility that had poisoned their recent interactions. Keith later said that being away from Mick had actually taught him to appreciate what his old friend brought to the band. Keith had tried being a frontman with his solo band, the Ex-Pensive Winos, and discovered that it was much harder than it looked. He gained new respect for Mick's skills as a performer and leader. Mick, meanwhile, had learned that his solo success was limited without the Rolling Stones brand and Keith's musical contributions. His solo albums had sold okay, but they lacked the power and authenticity that came from his partnership with Keith. He needed Keith's guitar playing and street credibility to reach his full potential. The result of their reconciliation was 1989's Steel Wheels, the strongest Rolling Stones album in years. The songs were focused and powerful, combining Keith's guitar mastery with Mick's pop sensibilities. More importantly, both men seemed energized by working together again. The Steel Wheels tour that followed was a massive success, grossing over $140 million and proving that the Rolling Stones were still one of the biggest live acts in the world. But the peace between Mick and Keith was fragile and required constant management. They developed a system for sharing power that acknowledged both men's strengths and egos. Mick remained the band's primary business manager and spokesman, but Keith had veto power over major musical decisions. They agreed to consult each other on important matters rather than making unilateral decisions. The press called it an uneasy truce, and that description was accurate. Mick and Keith were never again as close as they had been in their youth. Too much had happened. Too many harsh words had been spoken, but they found a way to work together professionally. Keith developed a new nickname for their relationship. He called Mick the Controller and himself the Madness. It was his way of acknowledging that Mick was better at handling business and logistics, while Keith brought the creative chaos that made their music special. Surprises, the business empire. What shocked many people was discovering just how much of a business empire Mick Jagger had built around the Rolling Stones. During his years of absolute control, he had created a complex web of companies, deals, and revenue streams that generated hundreds of millions of dollars. The Rolling Stones weren't just a band, they were a brand. Mick had negotiated deals for merchandise, licensing, publishing, and touring that maximized the group's earning potential. He had also invested the band's money wisely, creating a financial cushion that allowed them to be selective about projects. One of Mick's smartest moves was retaining ownership of the Rolling Stones' master recordings from 1971 onward. This meant that the band continued to earn money from album sales decades after the original release dates. Many other artists had sold their masters for quick cash, but Mick understood the long-term value of owning their catalog. He also created Promopub, a company that handled the Rolling Stones' publishing and merchandising. This allowed the band to keep a much larger percentage of the profits from their songs and image. Instead of giving 50% or more to outside companies, they kept most of the money for themselves. The touring operation that Mick built was particularly impressive. By the 1990s, Rolling Stones tours were massive productions involving hundreds of crew members, custom stages, and elaborate logistics. Each tour generated tens of millions of dollars in profit, making the band one of the highest-grossing live acts of all time. Mick's business acumen extended beyond the Rolling Stones. He invested in real estate, art, and other ventures. He also started a film production company, Jagged Films, which produced movies like Enigma and The Man from Elysian Fields. But perhaps his most surprising move was forming Super Heavy in 2011, a supergroup with Dave Stewart, Joss Stone, Damian Marley, and A.R. Rahman. The project was Mick's attempt to create something completely different from the Rolling Stones, incorporating world music influences and contemporary production techniques. Super Heavy wasn't commercially successful, but it showed that Mick was still trying to reinvent himself and push boundaries even in his late 60s. Keith, predictably, wasn't impressed with the project and made several sarcastic comments about it in interviews. The business empire that Mick created has allowed the Rolling Stones to continue operating well into their 70s and 80s. They can afford to be selective about tours and recordings because they have multiple revenue streams that don't require them to constantly work. Final years, the elder statesman. In their final years as active performers, Mick Jagger has evolved from a power-hungry control freak into something resembling an elder statesman of rock and roll. At 81, he has mellowed somewhat, though he still maintains tight control over the Rolling Stones' business operations. The death of drummer Charlie Watts in 2021 was a major blow to the band. Charlie had been the steady, reliable presence that helped keep the peace between Mick and Keith. His death forced the remaining members to confront their own mortality and the eventual end of the Rolling Stones. Their 2023 album, Hackney Diamonds, was seen as a tribute to Charlie and possibly their final studio recording. The album featured guest appearances from Paul McCartney Elton John and Lady Gaga, showing that Mick still had the connections and influence to attract major collaborators. But the recording process also revealed that the old tensions between Mick and Keith hadn't completely disappeared. Keith wanted the album to be more blues-focused, while Mick pushed for a more contemporary sound. They compromised, but both men acknowledged that working together was still sometimes difficult. The 2024 Hackney Diamonds tour was hugely successful, generating over $235 million from just 20 shows in North America. At 80 and 81 respectively, Keith and Mick proved that they could still deliver powerful live performances. But both men admitted that touring was becoming more physically demanding. Plans for a 2025 European tour were canceled, reportedly due to logistical issues and health concerns. For the first time, it seemed like the Rolling Stones might be acknowledging that they couldn't go on forever. Mick's control over the band has evolved over the decades. He's no longer the dictator he was in the 1980s, but he's still clearly the driving force behind most major decisions. Keith has accepted this arrangement, recognizing that Mick's business skills have been crucial to their longevity. In recent interviews, both men have been more reflective about their relationship and what they've accomplished together. Keith has acknowledged that Mick's controlling nature, while sometimes annoying, has been essential to the Rolling Stones' success. Mick has admitted that Keith's musical contributions are irreplaceable. Legacy, the price of control. Mick Jagger's secret battle for control of the Rolling Stones nearly destroyed the band, but it also saved them. His authoritarian leadership style created conflict and resentment, but it also kept the band functioning when other members were unable to handle business responsibilities. The question that remains is whether the Rolling Stones would have been better off with a more democratic leadership structure. Would they have been more creative if Mick hadn't consolidated so much power? Would they have stayed together longer if the other members had felt more valued? Keith Richards has suggested that the tension between him and Mick has actually been good for their music. The creative friction has pushed both men to work harder and come up with better ideas. Some of their best songs have come from periods when they were fighting with each other. Mick's business empire has certainly been good for the band's bank accounts. The Rolling Stones are worth an estimated $500 million collectively, with much of that wealth coming from deals that Mick negotiated and managed. They've been able to maintain their independence and artistic control because of their financial success. But the human cost has been significant. Mick's relationships with his bandmates have never fully recovered from the battles of the 1980s. Bill Wyman left the band partly because he felt excluded from decision-making. Mick Taylor quit for similar reasons. Even Charlie Watts sometimes seemed frustrated with Mick's controlling behavior. The Rolling Stones have influenced countless other bands, but few have copied their business model or leadership structure. Most successful bands either break up when tensions arise or find ways to share power more equitably. The Stones' survival with Mick as dictator is unique in rock history. Closing reflection: The Dictator's Dilemma. Mick Jagger's secret battle with the Rolling Stones reveals the fundamental dilemma of leadership in creative partnerships. Someone has to make the final decisions, handle the business, and take responsibility for success or failure. But absolute power inevitably creates resentment and conflict. Mick seized control of the Rolling Stones because he saw it as the only way to keep the band together and successful. Keith's drug problems and the other members' lack of business skills left a leadership vacuum that needed to be filled. Mick filled it completely, perhaps too completely. The price of his control was the loss of the democratic, collaborative spirit that had made the Rolling Stones special in their early years. Instead of a group of equal partners, they became Mick Jagger's backing band, with Keith Richards as his sometimes reluctant lieutenant. But would the Rolling Stones have survived without Mick's authoritarianism? Probably not. Too many great bands have been destroyed by drugs, ego conflicts, and poor business decisions. Mick's iron grip may have been suffocating at times, but it kept the band alive. In the end, Mick Jagger's secret battle wasn't really with the Rolling Stones. It was with the chaos and uncertainty that threaten all creative endeavors. His hunger for control came from a deep fear of losing everything he had worked to build. Whether his methods were right or wrong, they worked. The Rolling Stones are still performing, still making money, and still influencing new generations of musicians. Mick's legacy is complicated, but it's undeniably successful. The boy from Dartford who started out just wanting to sing the blues became one of the most powerful figures in the entertainment industry. He got everything he wanted, but the cost was higher than anyone imagined. The secret battle is over, but the scars remain.